Every veteran has a story. A story of sacrifice, courage, humor, and heartache. Each week, Veteran Story Hour captures these remarkable stories firsthand in the voices of those who've served. Recorded live from the weekly Friday brunch in the Saluda, Virginia studio in Waynesboro. This is more than a podcast. It's a living history, preserving the legacy of America's heroes. You're listening to Veteran Story Hour, Voices of Valor, presented by Saluda, Virginia. Let's begin. What happens when history isn't something you read in a textbook, but something you inherit? Today on Veteran Story Hour, we sit down with Jim Belcher Jr., the son of two survivors, one American, one Japanese, whose lives were shaped on opposite sides of World War II. His father served aboard the USS Indianapolis, a ship lost to torpedoes and sharks in one of the darkest chapters in naval history. His mother, just a schoolgirl in Japan, survived American bombings and wartime propaganda before forging an extraordinary post-war life in the United States. Jim's story is not just about survival. It's about memory and about what we remember, what we forget, and who gets to tell the story. It's about silence between generations, the weight of patriotism, and the uncomfortable truths about how America wages and remembers its wars. This conversation will challenge easy notions of enemy and ally and ask us to consider what it really means to serve a country and to carry its consequences. Ladies and gentlemen, Jim Belcher Jr.
I'm Jim Belcher Jr. My dad was a USS Indianapolis survivor, my mother Japanese, and I'm from Waynesboro, Virginia, originally born in Yokosuka, Japan, Navy brat. I do a program called Two Hearts, One Flag. It came out of starting, I would go and be invited to speak in schools on World War II history, specifically about the USS Indianapolis.
Yeah.
And I would talk about the history, and the ship's 610 feet long and was built in launched and commissioned in 32, and FDR ship estate, the real boring stuff. But the kids seem fascinated with the story because it ends with them being torpedoed after they took the atomic bomb to Tinian, which was loaded on the Enola Gay. 4 days after they delivered the bomb is when they were torpedoed and sunk. And so when I'm in the schools talking, it captivates the kids because I'm talking about them being in the water. You all know this is the 50th anniversary of Jaws.
Yeah.
And in Jaws, the monologue by Robert Shaw, Quint, he talks about being in the water with sharks, hence his motivation for not really liking sharks. And he based that on a true stories that were written initially by Thomas Helm, who interviewed a bunch of survivors, and it made its way into books that they were reading, the writers were reading, and Shaw was aware of. And they wrote that monologue from that, and that became the basis for the character Quint, to motivate everybody as to why they were out there trying to kill the shark, other than the obvious that it was eating people.
Right.
And so that monologue, 4 minutes and 20 seconds, I was in the theater at Waynesboro High School. I was a senior, just graduated, 18 years old, summer of 75. And when they started the monologue, I'm sitting there with half my football team on each side of me. And I remember I'm looking at the screen going, oh my gosh, you're talking about my dad's ship, which I had just learned about just a few years before that.
Sure, age-wise, right? It's probably not a bedtime story.
No, and Dad never talked about it when I was growing up.
Sure.
So, I looked at my buddies who knew my dad, and they're eating popcorn, drinking drinks. It's a movie, right? It's fiction. But at the end of the movie, I said, my dad was on that ship. And, then I get to, that's a bunch of BS and all that. And I said, no, he really was. And after that, they saw my dad in a whole different light, and so did I. Because that was the first time I'd ever heard the story told outside of Dad mentioning a very few words and then me going and reading a book. And So that motivated me later in years as I got older and had a little bit more motivation. Myself, Dad passed in 2001, and I never had an opportunity before that to didn't need to tell a story because he was right there. Now, he didn't talk much about it, but he got interviewed enough over the newspapers and radio stations and stuff on the anniversary of the sinking, which is 30 July 1945. Every year they would descend on our house. And it all started because of that monologue with Jaws. Most people, Americans, didn't even know about the Indianapolis. And certainly the Navy wasn't going to go out there and tell the story because they left the guys
Right.
out there
Yeah,
for
it's
four
a
and a half days. There were 1,195 on the ship. Dad was 18 years old, first ship. He'd only been on the ship 5 weeks and 3 days when the ship was torpedoed and sunk after midnight. He was able to survive. He never told me the whole story. I found out years after he passed what really happened out there in the water from another shipmate of his who was in his group that survived. And of course, that immediately made me think I got 1,000 questions I wish I could ask him, but never will get a chance to. And that's kind of what started me thinking I need to get out there and tell their story, not just his story, their story. And so, like I said, I went out there and started telling the Indianapolis story, which is basically history, not known to most kids, but
Sure.
certainly significant because of the atomic bomb and the greatest loss of life in the history of the United States Navy by a warship at sea. Stories that aren't told, only exceeded by the Arizona, which was
Right.
tied up at a pier. So and they represent the bookends of the war. First ship, essentially, first major warship sunk, high casualties, and the last major warship sunk, high casualties. So I felt like their story needed to be told, and it then opens up the whole of World War II in the Pacific. Once I started going out there and telling the story, I realized I would get emotional. And in the beginning, if you're a speaker, especially if you were young like me and not really wanting to be up there, but feeling I had to be, um, I would try to not show any emotion. Then, I don't know, one time I was talking about my dad and I started thinking about him and his crewmates all together at the reunions that we attended. And I just broke down. It took me a few minutes to pull myself back together. And when I did that and started again, the kids were totally captivated from that point on. And I realized then that it's okay to show some emotion when you're telling their story because it's an emotional story. I mean, it's got highs and lows, but the emotion is what connected these kids to this particular story. And I've always said the Indianapolis story, it's not one story. It's not one single story. It's like 11, 12 stories in one. And to tell the whole story, I've been in auditoriums for 2.5 hours trying to tell the whole story and still not got to everything. So
Right.
now it's kind of morphed into me basically looking at the group I've got to talk to and trying to share with them the few things that I've learned that would pertain to them
Right.
from these survivors. And I have a million stories about these guys because I spent from Dad passed in 2001. I was going to reunions since 77 when we attended the submarine launching of the SSN 697 USS Indianapolis. And I just remember every time was with these guys, I came away learning a little more, a little more. In 77, I was in uniform and we were going into the gate at Groton, Connecticut. I was in the Air Force and I was standing on the bus, Dad seated, his other radioman buddy that survived seated. I didn't know any of the other survivors. There were probably, I'm going to guess, there were 3 busloads of survivors and their spouses. I think I may have been the only child of a survivor. And of course, I was 19 in uniform. We came up to the gate at Groton. This is July 30th, the anniversary of the sinking, 1977. And for the launching ceremony, the gate was blocked. It was blocked by protesters. And remember, this is post-Vietnam.
Oh, yeah.
Um, Anti-nuclear, anti-war, kids my age, 19, 20 years old, standing out there beating on the bus, holding these signs with really horrible things written on them, flipping these guys the bird, all kinds of just totally disrespectful to these men. And I was angry. I was getting angry and angry. I just wanted to get off the damn bus.
I bet you did.
And I wanted to start swinging at these guys. Um, and I looked around the bus. I remember I looked around the bus at one point, and the guys are just sitting and talking. And we were there for 20 minutes waiting to get in. The police had to come, shove them out of the way, got our buses in. At the end of the thing, we come out, the protesters are gone, we go back to the hotel. We're sitting in the lobby waiting to go out to dinner, and I'm standing behind my father, and he's sitting at a round table, and there's several tables of guys just talking. They're talking about nothing. I mean, just family stuff and nothing about the war or nothing that I thought they'd be talking about.
Sure.
And at one point, one of the gentlemen across the way, one of the survivors, looked up at me, and I didn't know any of these men at that time. And he looked up at me, and of course, I'm in uniform, got my name badge on. And he says, "Belcher." He said, "What'd you think about today?" And he caught me totally by surprise because
You've just been a fly on the wall this whole time.
They are, to me, they are the epitome of what World War II was about.
Sure.
They're true heroes in my mind, and I'm learning as I'm listening to them. And I remember he caught me off guard, and I looked at him, and I'm still thinking about the gate. And I said, "Sir," I said, "I can't get out of my mind those kids at the gate." I said, "I just wanted to get out there. I was so angry. I just wanted to get out there and start swinging." And I remember him looking around the table at the other guys, and he looked confused. And then he looked up at me, and he said, "Belcher?" He said, "That's one of the reasons we fought that war, so they'd have the right to do that." And I remember at that moment, 19-year-old, airman first class, and I thought, man, he's teaching me why I'm wearing this uniform,
Mhm.
you know? And before that, you talked about flag burnings and things like that. I would have been the first guy to line up and sign a petition. We need to pass an amendment. You can't do that. It's against the law. After that, I'm just the opposite. I think every American has the right to protest as long as they're not hurting anybody any way they want. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't still get upset. I get very upset if I see that stuff. I still go out there and I'll probably hurt somebody if they do it right in front of me. But I realize that they have the right. And there aren't too many countries, if any, in this world where you can do that right in front of authorities and everybody and get away with it. So that's a wonderful thing.
Absolutely. And I think it's a really cool thing to call out like you do, which is this concept that the perspective of the men and women that fought in World War II,
Exactly.
like the bad guys, right? The
Yes.
enemy in is probably the most storied out of anyone that we talk about.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? Like they are the epitome of what an enemy is and the idea of those men and women that fought during this time period
Yes.
of who they're fighting against, what they're fighting for. I don't know if we've had that level of clarity since.
No, Dad said to me, and no offense to any, Dad was a World War II, Korea, Vietnam vet, and we used to fish a lot. And I would sit, and he was in country in all three. And I would just sit and listen to him, talk to him about, because I, at this point, had already served peacetime. I'm a Jimmy Carter vet. And I remember we'd talk about the wars, and I remember him saying something to me one time, and it's hard to repeat it because oftentimes I think some people get a little offended by what he said, but try to understand what he meant. He said, "We haven't fought a war since World War II." And I, of course, immediately said, well, everybody who was getting shot at in every conflict since then felt like they were in the war. And he said, yeah, I understand that. You know, he was one of those guys. He said, but what I'm trying to say is this country hasn't stopped and frozen in its tracks and supported our soldiers and sailors and Marines and airmen since World War II. That's when they sacrificed and wanted to get that war over quickly. And I said to Dad, I said, well, you know, I think you're right. I understand because I grew up during the Vietnam War and kept wondering why we weren't trying to win that war. I mean, you know, why weren't we fighting the war instead of, and Dad said something to me one time. He said, you know, you can't fight and talk at the same time. He said, watch kids in the schoolyard. I'd be talking, and then suddenly, one of them will stop talking and start swinging, and then they're just swinging, and then one of them's on the bottom, and one's on the top, and the one on the bottom is suddenly going, "Okay, let's talk about this." And Dad says, "That's how you fight a war. You have to stop talking, you gotta start fighting." And at some point, the guy on the bottom is gonna say, "Okay, let's talk about this." And he said, "We don't do that anymore. We try to talk and fight at the same time." And he said, "It just doesn't work." And that's what drove my dad out of the Navy was Vietnam. I remember he went to work, in 1968. He taught crypto school down at, Norfolk Naval Shipyard in Portsmouth,
Yeah.
Virginia, and he was in, at that point, 19 years during the height of the Vietnam War, and I remember him coming home, and he was upset about something. I was only, 11 years old, and I remember I asked him at the time what was wrong. He had said, he had gotten chewed out by his, lieutenant, which is a captain to the rest of us in other branches, lieutenant in the Navy. The commanding officer of the school had called him in his office. Dad had chewed out a young, student, uh, young Navy guy, for a uniform thing.
Yeah,
And
infraction.
Dad's like old school Navy, uh, and that was just part of the discipline cycle he was used to. He's a chief petty officer. But this officer chewed him out, and Dad came home and said, I'll never forget him saying that to me. He looked at me, and he was very sad. My dad was 6'4" and 230 pounds. He was a big guy.
He's a kindred spirit of mine then.
He said, yeah, he says, this lieutenant told him, says, you can't treat these young people that way. He says, Chief, he says, we're at war. And then he looked at my dad, and he said the exact wrong thing he could say. He said, do you know what it means to be at war?
Of all people to ask this question to.
Dad had been boots on the ground in Korea as a radioman as well, and so he told me that day. He said, "It's not my Navy anymore. It's time to get out." And that one incident made my dad decide that he was. I thought he was going to be in the Navy till I was an old man or something. He was just Navy. He wasn't angry at the Navy. He got angry at people in the Navy,
Sure.
including all the way back to the Indianapolis incidents. He never blamed the Navy. He blamed people in the Navy. But he loved the Navy itself, and he supported the Navy till the day he died.
I don't want it to be lost on anybody that's listening, because what you said that your dad, that simple phrase, right, is quite profound, which is you can't fight and think at the same time.
Right.
Or can't fight and talk. Now, that's quite profound. Right?
Yeah.
As we really think about any type of conflict that we're in, whether it's in civilian life or if we're talking about, military engagement. But the idea is like, no. And my only background, and I've shared with listeners before, right, is athletics, right? Is playing football and playing sports like that.
Right.
But it's true there as well.
Oh, yeah.
Which is you got to have somebody that's thinking. Somebody's talking, somebody is thinking, you got somebody that's there active, and then there's those of us that are there to fight.
Right. You're trained, and you don't have to think once you're trained. You just do what you're trained to do. And think about it. I mean, the orders they're giving you are counter to your training. So today, I constantly are hearing from our young soldiers and troops overseas that the rules of engagement are so ridiculous now that you're basically just putting them in a gun sight first and then saying, okay, if somebody shoots at you, okay, then it's okay. Well, that runs totally counter to every instinct any soldier or sailor ever had in their life. So I don't know how anybody can survive that kind of instruction. And I think it would be a different instruction if the person that was giving out the order was the first person in the gun sights. Then maybe it would be a little bit different order. But
Yeah,
that just seems to be the way it works.
well, even for me, like that was part of what drove me out of the Army itself, is because you're being told this is the standard, this is what you have to do, and then here I am trying to enforce this same standard to younger service members. And then I get told, like, I yell at a person for something and they're like, oh, hey, you can't yell at anybody.
Right.
I'm like, well, why not? We're in the Army. So like, if you don't want to get yelled at, then go do something else. Like that's an understood expectation.
It's crazy. I went in 76 and everything was way different then. I knew in 76, I grew up with a chief petty officer who basically prepared me for basic training. And certainly he was preparing me for boot camp in the Navy in 1944, 43. He wasn't preparing me for 1976 U.S. Air Force basic training. So I went in totally over-prepared for basic training and literally was probably the first person, my sergeant told me I was the first person he'd ever talked to who during smoke breaks, I would ask him if I could go out and run on the track because I didn't smoke. And he looked at me in San Antonio, Texas, this guy wants to go out in his uniform and run around the track. And I was thinking, I was third in the state in the high hurdles my senior year. And I'm going, I'm getting out of shape serving in the Air Force in basic training. It was horrible. 10 sit-ups, 10 push-ups, if you could do them.
If you could do
and one lap around the track, 440 yards. And that's what we started with. And we did that for a week. Then we'd add another 10 and one more lap. And it was just, I was used to doing a lot more than that. And literally the first couple of weeks, I was getting out of shape. So, I was probably the first person to do that. One thing I wanted to share with you, though, that my dad was so full of wisdom. And, he and I were like water and oil growing up. Now, man, I'm a kid of the 60s and 70s. I got long hair, torn jeans, didn't wear socks, didn't like wearing a belt. All the things a chief petty officer would get really, really under his skin, I did it. I did it on purpose. I'm the oldest of 3 boys. And, I'm like in charge of the other 2 knuckleheads, my 2 brothers. So anytime they screwed up, I got in trouble. Our family was a Navy family.
Yeah.
And Dad treated me like, the next beneath him in the chain of command. So I remember him saying to me one time, we were fishing out on Lake Monticello over in Albemarle County or whatever, I guess Albemarle. And I asked him, just out of curiosity, I said, Dad, what would it take? I mean, why is it we're getting into these long, protracted wars? Because I grew up, Vietnam was the war that I grew up watching. And then I started watching these desert wars as I'm an older adult and thinking, I remembered what Dad said. We haven't fought a war since World War II. So I asked him, I said, Dad, what do we got to do to stop this cycle that we're in? And I remember he didn't even think about it. He just looked at me and he says, well, it's all in the way we pay for it. And I said, what do you mean? He said, in World War II, they sold bonds to finance the war. And the American people had to pay for the war. And if they didn't pay for the war, we weren't fighting. And we'd either have to surrender or take a pounding. He said, but those were your choices. And he said, so the American people, they funded the war. They paid for the war. They were in the war with us.
Yeah.
He said, we haven't done that. Right after World War II, the government and the military said, it's a lot of work and money. And, of course, a lot of propaganda to raise all this money to finance a war. World War II, the entire world was at war. In 3.5 years, that thing was wrapped up for the United States.
Yep.
I've grown up watching Vietnam. I mean, it was almost my entire childhood. And then the desert wars. I was working at Raytheon on Patriot missiles.
Mm-hmm.
When Saddam Hussein marched into Kuwait. And I remember them, ringing up the guys up in Andover, Mass at Raytheon and saying, hey, we need something that can shoot down a missile, a Scud. And that technology didn't exist that day. And Raytheon started working on it. All of us started working on it. I'm in a repair depot, so we're working on the equipment that's going into the systems. It's coming back out of the fields. And before you know it, we're shooting down Scud missiles. And I was thinking, well, this should end the war. He can't drag Israel in by, scudding them. And we came real close to World War III. I remember that. And then I was thinking, but we're still not trying to win this war. We went in and occupied Iraq and took care of that, but we hadn't won the war yet. And then we, tried to occupy and just sit there and let our politicians talk it out. And we basically gave them their country back before they were ready to run their country.
But you said a really interesting phrase right there. He goes, "We weren't trying to win the war."
Right. And Dad said that to me over and over
Dad's got it.
With Vietnam. He said that we're not trying to win this war.
Yeah, I mean, I think the really, like, 9/11 is probably the next time that the entire nation is fully invested in anything war related,
Yep.
and even that doesn't last from the entire span of the country for that long.
No.
Like, everyone gets that knee-jerk reaction, and then you have, like, the group of people who are like, "Yes, I'm going in the military now." They're separated by everybody else of like, "Okay, well, you guys went and did that. Well, now what happens?" And now you're in that occupancy state. You're not trying to win or lose, you're just stagnant.
That same day we were talking about how you win a war and what you have to do to commit. He was suggesting that we need to stop. We need to have enough money, tax money, to hold and train and have a standing army military that's ready, and train them. That's what our tax money should go to. For deployments, he was thinking that's what the American people need to pay for. If we're going to deploy troops overseas, then they need to pay for that. They need to buy bonds and so on. And the government then has to open up and say why they need to be there and how long they're going to be there. Because one thing we know about the American people is they're not going to let a war go on for 20-some years unless you've already got your hand in their pocket, taking the money out of their wallet, which is the way it's happening.
Right.
Our government has no incentive. I worked for Raytheon. I worked for defense contractor. I've worked around defense contractors all my life. Trust me, there's no incentive for a war to end if you're working for a defense contractor. I mean, everything, yeah. It's crazy. The economy. When the economy goes south, what does the government usually do? They spend money on things like defense to stimulate the economy. So they're just taking the money out of your pocket. And I think my dad was right. I think if we could figure out a way to tie actual fighting, a war, the Desert War is a good example. You know, the whole fabrication of stories or whatever for weapons of mass destruction. And when we get there, we find out, okay, it's not quite what we thought it was going to be. But we're here and we're going to win this thing anyway. And we tactically did win it. But we didn't strategically win it. We then turned to our government, State Department, to wrap everything up. And you see how that worked out. There's too much politics. Like my dad said, you know, once that kid's on the ground, you got him, your foot on his throat and he wants to talk, then you take terms that will work. And as much as we learned on the rebuilding of Europe after World War II, the rebuilding of Japan after World War II, those are our allies now. We've not turned any of these people into our allies since then. I mean, I question even if Vietnam is as threatened as they are by China right now, they could take either side. And that's kind of scary when you think about it.
Yeah, what was it called? Resurgent math? It's like...
yeah, I know what you mean.
Resurgent math right now is what's happening in the Desert Wars and what continues to happen, which is, right, you take out 10, but you make 40.
Exactly.
And then it continues to grow from there, which is almost, not to take us too far down a path, but almost like that's almost by design.
Well, truly is, whether it be by intelligent design or not. Yeah. I agree.
We spent a lot of really good time on Dad. While Dad is making his way in the Pacific,
right,
going to deliver, right, a bomb. Where's your mom at this time?
My mom is early part of the war. She's attending school. Her oldest brother's in the Imperial Japanese Army. My uncle was in the Imperial Japanese Army serving in China. Mom is living in Sasebo, Japan, which at the end of the war is pretty much where all the ships and submarines ended up besides Tokyo Bay and Yokosuka. Mom is just trying to survive. Towards the middle of the war, the bombings are getting more and more frequent. She's living a lot of her time. She's a middle child of 8. Her oldest brother's away, but the rest are too young to serve or are girls. And she's responsible for the younger children, getting them into the air raid shelters. And she said it was just constant. If a plane flew over, um, they went into the shelters. And she said we would hear the bombs, and then we would come out 3 different times. Schools were burnt to the ground. I asked her one time, I said, Mom, was there ever anything in your school or anything that you had that you truly missed after the war? And she says, yeah. She said she loved to sew. And by the middle of the war, you couldn't get any supplies, anything new. You had to rely on what you had. And she had a sewing kit. And she took it to school and she put it in her desk at the school. And that night, the bombs burned her school to the ground and she lost her sewing kit. And to the day, this is probably 50 years later, I'm asking her this question. And it still hurt her that her sewing kit had been burned to the ground. She lost it. It took her years to replace that after the war because there were so many shortages and food was more important than things like that. Ironically, when we lived here in Waynesboro, Dad retired from the Navy and moved us here to work at General Electric. She went to work at Augusta Cleaners in Waynesboro, and she was their chief alterations person, and she was awesome at it because right behind them is Fishburne Military School.
Yeah.
And these kids would come over to the Augusta Cleaners, and they would ask these women who were raised civilians, had never seen uniforms other than...
Oh, yeah.
And they're saying, I need these patches on, and they're trying to read the books and the manuals and look at the papers and everything, and Mom's just sewing them on because she knows where everything belongs because she's used to military uniforms. She did all my dad's uniforms.
Just whizzing them out.
Yeah, yeah. So that it got to where the guys at Fishburne, the instructors, everything, they specifically would ask for her. And towards the end of her career in the 70s, well, she worked through the 80s, she was known as the one to take especially military uniforms too in this area. So mom did really well, and it all came out of that sewing kit, that she had when she was a little girl. Yeah. So her life was rough. She told me one time, I said, well, so what happened after the third school? And she said, well, the parents were so afraid that the Americans were bombing the city, so they moved the children up into the smaller towns up in the mountains.
Sure.
And she said, I'm up in the mountains there. And she said, one day I saw my first American. And I said, oh, wow, this ought to be a great story. I said, what'd you see? And keep in mind, before that, Japanese propaganda was really, really strong. It is in every country, including the United States.
Being young, right? So like for me, right, I was born in 88,
yes.
So we can give our timeline. But when I'm in history class growing up, when we get to World War II and we're learning about it,
right.
My teachers always were really big. They would show us to make sure we understand I'm from California.
Okay.
Right. So understanding what happened to the Japanese Americans in California was a very normal thing for us being Californians. And I don't know if the rest of the country got that history lesson.
Not as much. Not as much.
Those
because the East
camps,
Coast, West Coast.
Exactly.
Different.
Right. But those camps and the stealing of property and essentially the imprisonment of Japanese Americans out of fear of being spies, then there's a lot of things that are tied to that.
Right.
But they would show us the propaganda that Disney participated in, that Warner Brothers participated in. It was outrageous even for me being early 2000s, way before, let's say, the woke world in which we live now.
Right.
But even back then, you're just like, bro, like this is out of control.
It's so true. And the West Coast, so much more exposure to Asian Americans in the 60s and 70s when I was growing up. I could imagine in the 40s with all the farms and the Japanese Americans who served there. One thing, I want to go ahead and I'll finish telling you what Mom said, though. She said the propaganda was Americans were cruel, barbaric, dirty people, and that we were going to come and kill them. And even if they surrendered, we were going to kill them. And see, this is something we don't teach. I learned this when I'm in middle school, and they're teaching American history, World War II, and I'm going, they're teaching that the Japanese, they worship the emperor, and he's a god, and they'll do whatever he's told, and that's why they wouldn't surrender, and da-da-da-da-da. Oh, they don't value life like we do. They're not Christians. I mean, these are the things I was taught.
Oh, yeah.
And I remember talking to my mom, and she said, oh, no. I said, we didn't want to die, but they were going to kill us anyway. And I was thinking, why don't we teach that in school? Because as I watch the Desert Wars progress, I'm watching the American people over here who aren't nearly as alarmed as people were in World War II, with what's going on over there. But the families of the soldiers and people that were over there were very glued to every word. And they were basically teaching through images on CNN and so on that every person in the Middle East wants to lop our heads off. And if they're wearing, a hijab or something, they're the enemy. And so people here were taking it out on all those people that had fled those countries to be here and not there. And they were treating them just like my mother had described Americans, cruel, barbaric, dirty people, and we need to kill them all, and they're going to kill us. They're going to kill us. So we developed this propaganda machine, allows people to hate. My dad said to me one time, he says, I've been 3 wars. He says, you can't kill somebody you don't hate, so you have to learn to hate them first. And he says, so in the military, when World War II was over, he met my uncle, my mom's brother, and, you can imagine that's a whole nother story by itself. But
it's got to be,
well, that's
a super interesting meeting.
For sure.
But by the time they got finished talking, they found out they both loved to fish, they both loved woodworking, they both loved gardening. They were warriors on the opposite sides of the world fighting a war against each other. And there's a mutual respect after a war for a soldier who fought honorably in their military, even if it was against you. And it took my dad years to get to that point, of course, and Mom kind of accelerated that little schedule, I'm sure. But my uncle and my dad became best friends. They were closest in the family. And I think it was that mutual respect, that warrior mentality that they both did and sacrificed and lost so much during that war. They understood each other, and there was a mutual respect. Whereas that propaganda machine doesn't get turned off for all the other people. I cannot tell you how many times in the 60s and 70s I saw people come up to my mother and say some terrible, terrible things to her. Things like, you don't belong here. You need to go back to the country you come. She was a naturalized American in 63, 62. I'm watching this as a child and thinking, what is wrong with these people? One day she was down at the cleaners and a woman chewed her out and told her, your English, it's horrible. You don't belong here. Go back to where you belong. You're stupid. And she came home. My mother was crying. I remember I was home, and Dad came home soon after that. And my mom and Dad were not huggy, kissy people. They were very, anyway, it's a Japanese thing too. They don't like hugging and all that stuff. And so our whole family grew up that way. But I remember my dad grabbing my mom and holding her, and she was bawling like a baby. And I remember my dad looking over my shoulder and saying, if I can forgive, why can't they? And I thought, you know what? The people that are holding the grudge, for the most part, are the people that weren't there.
Oh, that is 100% true.
They weren't there.
Even growing up, so John and I are born in the same year and grew up on opposite sides of the country.
Yeah.
And it's a very similar learning experience that, even in the Desert Wars or when they talk about anything that happened in history before that, there's always some hatred pretense to anything that's said about it. And so, you can't go about anything from a neutral party.
Right.
And I don't understand, even for me, why you have to pick a side in something or how you can choose to be so angry about something that you didn't partake in.
Exactly.
If I'm going to be mad about it, it's going to be something that I have control over or I have some stake in.
Right.
I'm not just standing. It'd be like me coaching football and standing, at Klein's while the football game's going on and being pissed off at the outcome.
Right.
I'm not even there.
So I'm not in the game. I'm not on the field.
Yeah. What right do I have to make any sort of projection one way or the other when I don't have any stake or investment in this?
Now,
it's an overcompensation, right? At the end of the day, you're overcompensating for a fact that you didn't participate. It's always, and let me describe that a little bit better, my thought, right? In today's world, as we talk about, I kind of reference the woke concept, right?
Right.
It always seems to be, what seems to be very consistent is the folks that are not being attacked for whatever the attack might be, they're always the ones that take the greatest offense on behalf of the group that is receiving said attack, where you talk to, like, for your mother, for your father, the very lived experience of that. It's just like either it's water off a duck's back, or it just is, hey, we have to, like, love to forgive all these types of pieces. But it's everybody else. It's just like they can't. It's like a shard of glass. They can't let go of it.
I tell you what I learned, and this is from being around these particular combat vets most of my life, and my dad in particular. I do a talk around the country too, where me and Desmond Doss Jr., Desmond Doss, Hacksaw Ridge, his dad, we got to talking about our dads one day, and we started doing a talk together about it on stage. We'd say, it was a program, the title was "He's Just My Dad." And we started talking about our dads and the PTSD, the trauma they suffered, which was undiagnosed back then, as far as calling it anything like that. No treatment. You went home, the church and your family took care of you, and that was or you self-medicated, or all of the above.
Right.
And it hasn't changed that much in all these years. I mean, trauma's trauma. One thing, going back to what you said, though, that I think I learned from conversing with my father and thinking about it over the years, especially since he's been gone, is with the warrior, with the soldiers, it's turned off when the war's over. Then they're not our enemies anymore. Now we're trying to help them. We're trying to rebuild them. We're trying to get them back on their feet. And regardless of how they fought, what they did, whatever, as long as it was above board, wasn't in the super cruelty range, as some were. Unless you were POW or something like that, typically what you're carrying is the pain of loss of a friend or buddies or even parts of yourself. I've always said no combat veteran comes home whole. They always leave a part of them out there. So I think but the civilian population never has it turned off.
Sure.
See, and nobody comes home and says to grandma and grandpa and mom and dad and brother and sister and uncles that, I'm moving past that. Most soldier sailors, military, that were combat vets choose to just put it behind you and move on. But the others don't move on. They're carrying it. They carry it like it's their burden, their
account.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And
I mean, you have because even in my experience with talking to people who've done all kinds of wild things, combat related, you get most of them, they don't talk about things that happen.
Right.
Or, stuff that's done different. Like, yeah, there's cool stories that they'll tell you. And then there's this entire other group of stories that you will never have any exposure to because they're all dark, guarded. There's some sort of traumatic event that is attached to them.
Totally true.
And so I think that comes when you go home and you talk to mom, dad, uncle, aunt, and your friends, that doesn't come out because you don't want them to see that part of you. So now they don't know what you're carrying. And so it's hard for them to let go of what stigma they feel because they don't know what you're dealing with.
They're angry.
Yeah.
Theirs is anger. To the guy that was there, it's way beyond anger. It's pain, internal pain.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think that's why the veteran has to bury it to move on. And you never do completely move on. It's always there, even as you go through healing cycles. And that's the other beautiful thing about hanging around these guys since 77, all the way up till now. We still have one living survivor off the Indianapolis who I talk to frequently. Those guys had time to offload some of that pain. And I've watched the journey with these fellas, and I know what's ahead for any of you all, any other combat vets, because I feel like it's a process where you bury it. We did a survey and found out that the average time for the Indianapolis survivors before they could speak about it, and this is just speak about it, not any detail, and it always came out in little chunks, was 27 years. Now think about our Vietnam vets, 27 years after 73. 27 years after 91, 27 years after now. These guys that are carrying that, that's an average. Some spoke right away and some never spoke. But the average was 27, and we did over 100. We surveyed over 100 of the survivors. So that tells you something right there, too, is that in order to move on with life, I think it's a natural process to bury it. And people trying to get you to bring it up and dredge it up may be part of the reason why we're at 22 a day.
Well, that's what I was just going to say.
Yeah.
You know, the natural thing is to bury it for a while. Let it. It's going to fester and grow, but it's not nearly as traumatic as trying to bring it up and talk about it before you're ready to talk about it. And I think that's what's going on.
You talking about it versus being made to talk about it.
There you go.
Two completely different scenarios.
You're trusting that this educated person over here is telling you, who's probably never been through this kind of trauma, but is telling you that it's for your own good to talk about it now. And I get it that the sooner you can move on, but you have to be ready. And I don't think most of these guys are ready, but they are. In some instances, I think they're being kind of pushed towards talking about it now, as if to convince them that this will help them feel better sooner.
Well, and it's an interesting thing, too, because as you see that the suicide rates continue to go up and those numbers continue to get more aggressive and more depressing, honestly, right, to be able to hear what the real values are, it would be an interesting correlation of looking at those charts as those suicide rates continue to go up. And when did we start trying to force them maybe to talk before that they're ready, and relive that trauma before that their brain is truly ready.
I'm not a psychologist. My youngest brother is. I'm not a psychologist, but I'm just speaking from what I see and what I know. Evident. And I do know these World War II veterans, this particular crew anyway, very, very well. I ran the reunions for 15 years. Many of these guys were my dearest, dearest friends. After my dad passed in 2001, every time one of those guys would pass, I felt like I was losing my dad again, over and over and over. It was Groundhog Day for me. You know, it's sort of like working in a hospital, in a cancer ward or something. You don't want to get too close to them because when they're gone, you know the pain. But for whatever reason, I just kept putting myself in that position. I think I felt like I owed it to my dad. I owed it to all those guys who didn't. 79 sailors did not come home. There were 1,195 on the ship. 316 were pulled out of the water 4.5 days later. I always said that I had a confrontation one time, we'll call it a conversation with a lost at sea family member. Lost at sea and survivor families are two different entities. Blue Star, Gold Star. I mean, they're talking to me as if, and these are his exact words. He says, "You're lucky. Your father came home." And I looked at him and I was thinking, yeah, part of my dad came home. Good chunk of him came home.
Yeah, but physically he came home.
But there's a big part of him still out there. It died out there with his buddies. And I got to thinking about that. I said, I understand. I don't know your pain because I'm not a lost at sea member. I'm not a Gold Star family. I said, but I do know my pain. And I wouldn't say to you, you're lucky, because you didn't have to grow up with an alcoholic dad, who was extremely physical and psychological. I mean, I had my drill instructor in basic training told me on the last day, everybody else went, 2 of us had to stay over. He was pissed because he had to stay extra night with us. He called me into his office and he says, "Belcher," he's reading my file, and I'm standing there parade rest. "Belcher," he says, "looks like you set a record for the lowest number of demerits ever in basic training." I remember looking at him and I'm thinking, it took everything I had for 6 weeks not to laugh through this thing because my dad was 10 times worse than any drill instructor. Number one, drill instructors couldn't hit you in 1976. My dad had a saying, he said, there's a fine line between fear and respect. And I feared him because I knew what was coming if I didn't do what he said. The word why, W-H-Y, did not exist in my family. We were never allowed to say why when Dad said do something. And that's the way I grew up. So going to basic training, I was already at step 3 or 4 while they were still trying to get the other kids caught up.
They're still reading a manual.
I remember
You've lived the manual.
Charlie Poland, the Commonwealth's attorney here in Waynesboro, before I went in, he was an Army Korean War vet. I asked him, I said, Charlie, I said, you got any advice for me before I go in? He says, yeah. He says, don't volunteer. And I said, for what? He said, anything.
Yeah, anything. Don't ever volunteer.
So of course, the first night, they're throwing the trash can down, 4 o'clock in the morning, into the day room. We need flight chiefs, and we need squad leaders and all this and all these. And I'm captain football team, all this stuff. My hand is down. I'm hearing Charlie's voice, and don't volunteer, don't volunteer. So all these hands are shooting up, and they get their crew, and then they start assigning things. And I got the water fountain. I had to keep the water fountain clean.
That a baby.
So for 6 weeks, nobody drank out of my water fountain. I just stood right there in front of it whenever I knew they were going to come in there, and made them go into the head and drink out of the faucets.
That's right.
So I never got a demerit.
That's how I keep this clean. I just won't let you use it. I respect that.
I had a Marine Corps lieutenant, had a really, really sweet young lady go into the Marine Corps a couple of years ago, and I found out how things have changed since then. They set up online accounts and everything. She's going through pre-basic, getting ready to go in, get inducted and all of that, and she's already online. And she asked the same question I asked. Do you have any advice? She's asking me, and I said, yeah, don't volunteer. And she said, for what? And I said, anything. And then right away, this lieutenant, Marine Corps lieutenant, jumps in there. She's like overwatching her account. They set it up for me. And she goes, Mr. Belcher, that's not very good advice to give a new recruit. We want them to excel. We want them to be the very best they can be, do the best they can at every single. And I'm thinking, my God, I know the military hasn't changed that much. The only difference is she's listening in our conversation now. Mm-hmm. Oh, poor Ellie.
Oh, yeah. You're now no longer getting asked if you want to volunteer. You are now assigned the shittiest thing that can be thought of, because she read your page and was like, yep,
my gosh.
Check, found number 1 right there.
So back to my mother, she ended up surviving the war. Her first time she saw an American GI was a story that I love to share. She's told they're cruel, barbaric, dirty people, and she's terrified, 11 and a half years old. And she said she's out, her and some friends her friends are walking up this rice paddy road, and this American fighter plane comes down. And it comes down, and my mother makes the machine gun noise. It's hilarious hearing a Japanese imitate an American machine gun on an airplane. And it's like, rat, tat, 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 tat. And she zooms right by. And she said, I looked up and I saw him. And I said, what'd you see? And she said, he's got red skin and bald head and big eyes. He looked like a bug. I'm thinking, this poor pilot's got his skull cap on, his goggles. And the cockpit is slid open because it's probably 110 degrees inside there.
Sure.
And that was what she thought Americans look like insects. That was her first 11-and-a-half-year-old girl, and she was terrified. So when the invasion, after the surrender, and that's another story I try to bring to young people, is the story of how the Japanese surrendered, because we're taught basically, Hirohito should have been hung and all of this stuff. Well, Hirohito is the one that, in order to preserve the Japanese people against the will of the army, he surrendered. He recorded 2 messages to be played over national radio against the will of his army, who was in charge of the government, really running it. The Navy didn't support the army. And we need to teach the dynamics of this when we're teaching World War II history, because it's very important to understand that Japan was split, and the emperor was the deciding vote, and he decided to surrender. And the Japanese, actually, there was a coup attempt trying to kill him in the days before that message got broadcast. Had they succeeded, Japan would not have surrendered, because the army would have been in control, and the emperor would have been locked up in another room or killed. So I kind of look at that and I think that is kind of important to teach our kids, is that, not everybody on the other side is as crazy as we are being taught to believe that they were.
Or aligned.
Exactly.
Right? Like the idea of divisions that we know exist within our own governments, our own people, the idea of why would that be any different?
Exactly. My mother was one of those girls that was trained in school with a sharpened bamboo stick. She was told, kill one American before you die. Remember the propaganda. She was told, if you're going to die,
Right.
they're going to kill you, but kill one. If you kill one, you go to heaven. Does this sound familiar?
Sure does.
And
A little bit.
History repeats itself over and over and over. And if we teach this in school to our young people, then they'll better understand what's going on today in the Middle East and Israel and all the places that we're seeing these horrible things coming up, probably in Asia again.
Yeah.
There's just I'm 68 years old. I've seen war after war after war. The only time I found out we weren't at war was when I got out in 1980 and the American Legion approached me and said, "Hey, we'd like you to be a member because you're pretty active about stuff." And I said, "Can't join." And they looked at me and said, "Well, why not?" I said, "I'm a peacetime veteran." They said, No, you just had to have one conflict. You don't have to have been there or anything." I said, 76 to 80, no conflicts. I mean, the hostage situation was resolved after I got out.
Yep.
So it never happened. And I said, that made me realize to have a 4-year period of peace, total peace, and be a veteran in this military is very unusual, very unusual. So I appreciate, as much as I was not a fan of Jimmy Carter and the inflation and the time, I do appreciate that we never were at war with anybody.
You said mom survives, right? She survives the war, obviously, because a lot of great stories of her being back stateside and doing the things that she did.
Yep.
Did she ever talk about what it was like when the bombs do drop in Japan?
Oh, yeah. She talked a lot about taking her younger siblings into the shelters. I went back in 2003 to Japan. I was actually born at Yokosuka Naval Hospital in Japan. That's how I'm the only Japanese-born child. I was a dual citizen at birth. I went back in 2003 to visit, and she took me and showed me the bomb shelters that are still there on the side of the hills. She remembered vividly what it was like during those bombings. As Americans, we're typically not exposed to that kind of situation. So listening to her talk brought a whole nother perspective to me as an American for what we should be appreciative of, that we don't have to worry about things like that. I mean, the closest we've ever come in modern times is 9/11 at the Pentagon in New York. But most Americans are not living in fear daily of an aerial attack or in any way being reached like that.
Well, that's like I remember so when I was stationed in New Mexico, one of the things that we did was we got to go tour the Trinity site.
Yeah.
And, as a history kid, I'm standing here, in this site where this bomb was built, and all these things are going through my mind that I know, because at this point, we all know what happens after that gets built.
Right.
And no one else understands, like, the magnitude of where we're standing.
Right.
Like, what the entire principle of, like, this location stands for in the United States.
Well, because my mother and father, I feel like I kind of got the crash course in that because I didn't mention before, my grandfather was working at Nagasaki on August 9th. He was in the shipyard working there. He survived the bomb blast, but died a few years later.
Sure.
And so Dad helped deliver the Hiroshima bomb, little boy, and Mom's dad, my grandfather, was on the receiving end of the second bomb. So when we talk about World War II, oftentimes when I'm in the schools, I'm talking about those atomic bombs. And my mother said something that really, really hit hard for me because we're taught in school that we probably should feel somewhat guilty for having delivered those bombs. I had a young college student at Blue Ridge Community College once during a program where I had 4 survivors and 2 rescue men on stage, and I was moderating. And we were doing questions at the end of the program, and I asked for questions. And a young 18-year-old college kid stood up in the back of the room, and he says, and this was his words exactly, he said to the survivors, he said, "Do you feel guilty for having delivered the atomic bomb that killed so many innocent civilians?" because that's what we're taught and in school. And I remember at the time, I just asked my mom that question a few months before, and she's sitting in the front row. So before I let these guys answer, who I know their answers,
Oh, that's so gangster.
I turned to my mom.
That's so gangster.
I said, Mom, would you stand up and tell this young man what you were there? Your father was there. I said, would you tell him what you just said to me a few months ago? And she stood up with the microphone. I'll never forget her saying this. She said, dropping those bombs saved my life. Had the United States not dropped those bombs, my emperor wouldn't have surrendered, and I wouldn't have survived the war. I would have died with that bamboo stick trying to kill an American. She said, no. She said that we were happy when the emperor announced the end of the war. She said, we were happy. The war was over. We were starving. And why don't we teach this?
Well, yeah, nobody talks about what it's like to be on the bottom.
Exactly.
Like in a conflict of, even if you're in a fight and you're getting beat up, everybody talks about the dude who did all the ass whipping. Like, they don't talk about what the guy on the bottom's feeling like or looks like.
Right.
They're just like, oh, yeah, he just got beat up.
And even going back, I relate that to, again, conversations with my mom and my dad about the war. And think about this, every war. The combatants are, they're the guys in uniform, or in the case of terrorism now, not so much uniform, but they have an ideology. But they're the minority of the population. The majority of the population just wants to survive.
Yeah.
They just want to get to the day when somebody surrenders and this is over. And they're sitting on the fence. And I remember seeing it in Vietnam. By day, they're with the Americans. By night, they're with the North Vietnamese. They have to pick sides based on who's got their life in their hands. And so that's the reality of war today for most of those people. And that was the Japanese in World War II. I don't know how the German population felt, but I know the Japanese population, through propaganda, felt that during the occupation, the Japanese felt like their lives were in the hands of the Americans until they realized the propaganda was not true. My mother told me a story. She said the day she realized that they had been lied to, she said American GIs would come down the road during the occupation. The kids would hide inside the houses. And she said they would throw candy and toilet paper and soap, and American GIs, they know what's going on. And they realized that these kids were not eating the candy. And they knew why. Because the parents and the government had told them that they're going to kill us.
Yeah, it's all poisonous.
It's all going to be poisonous. Don't
yeah.
touch it. So my mother, who hadn't seen candy in 3 years, said, we threw it away, we threw it away, we threw it away. She said one day a couple of GIs are walking down the road, and one of them tosses the candy, and he realizes what's going on. He jumps over their little stone fence, randomly picks up a piece of candy and pops it in his mouth. And my mother's exact words were, that's the moment I knew they lied to us. She's talking about her government and her family. Her parents lied to her.
Yeah.
Because they believed what the government said.
I was going to say, it's hard to not, at that point, it's almost just blind following.
She said then when the GIs would come down the road, the kids would go out there and they'd grab them, hold them, hugging their legs. Guys are trying to walk down the road with kids hanging all over them. You guys know, you see the images in every country we've been in.
Mm-hmm.
That's what the American GI represents. Probably the best ambassador we have is the American GI. My mother said to me, her brother comes home at the end of the war, after the war, and she said the American GIs were kinder to us, children, than our own.
Oh, I could only imagine.
And in Japanese society, very much the man is the top of the heap. The oldest son is next, then the wife, then the children, and the boys higher than the girls. She said the American GIs were blind to that.
Because they got babies at home too, man.
Exactly.
Like, they have a little sister at home. They know what's up.
So, I just thought it took a GI to get through to my mom and her family that they had been lied to. And I think that, to me, that's a golden story. That's the kind of thing that we need to know, and we need to pass on to our GIs that are serving all around the world now, that are in harm's way. And, they just want to come home alive and bring their friends home alive. But there's no guarantees when you're over there.
Well, yeah. There's also the basic humanistic aspect
Right.
that gets missed 100% of the time, except for when you tell a story like that of your mom, because nobody talks about the good things that happen.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
then, so to go back to something you were talking about earlier, when you're talking about stories of with you and your dad's friends
Mhm.
and all his shipmates. So I had a conversation with somebody, I've had it multiple times of, so when you tell a story to an individual and then you tell a story to an individual who is a veteran or has a similar life experience than you,
Yes.
they're two totally different outcomes of the same story
Mhm.
because the relationship that that person can give you in perspective is different
Yeah.
than a complete outsider, as we'll call it, into a scenario.
That's why we need to hear these other stories from the other side.
Oh,
I've
absolutely.
always been a two-perspective person. When I speak in schools, I talk about Japan from the Japanese perspective because I think it's important. You can relate that to every enemy this country's ever had in conflict or war.
And you're in such a unique position to where you can be an ambassador to do that.
Yeah. So my service in the Air Force literally just launched me into a position where I was then able to go in with some legitimacy and talk about veteran issues, and in particular, our older veterans who taught me so much. And I think our younger veterans are learning from, those Vietnam vets now, and now the early Desert War veterans who are speaking a little bit more and passing on these, I call them lessons. That's why I go to schools. These kids, they need these lessons to balance out what they're learning or thinking or hearing from the media and from just American history, which, American history is written by the victors. History is written by the victors. So
Oh, yeah.
everybody's history is different.
When the textbooks are written by the government.
Exactly.
So the reality is it even gets parsed down even further.
So I think it's incumbent on all of our veteran community. I know a lot of people don't want to go in and talk to kids in school. They don't want to talk about it.
Yeah.
But you don't have to talk about the specifics. You said it earlier. You don't have to talk about the specifics. You just need to teach the lesson.
Oh, yeah.
You need to tell them why it's important that they understand this conflict or this situation or that. You need to give them some hope. And that's what I try to do when I go into schools now is give them hope because, my gosh, our young generations today, they're surrounded by negativity, by give up, by it's not worth your time or effort. They're giving up. And I'm trying to give them hope that things are going to be better, that things are better, and it's in your hands. I had a civil rights leader in Stanton tell me one time, he said, Jim, how many branches of government are there? And what are we taught?
Three.
Three, right? Three. Legislative, executive, judicial. And he said, nah, you're wrong. He said, there are four. He said, the American people are the fourth branch. And I thought about that. I said, you know what? If you read the Constitution, I mean,
Yep.
just literal, we the people. It starts out that way.
Right? It starts right there.
and I thought, why aren't we teaching that in public school? And think about
Oh, I know why.
oh, well, you can imagine why.
We all know why.
But think about the system. We're not even questioning that until somebody like Tom Barres, the civil rights leader that said it to me. I'm going, I thought I was a pretty intelligent person until he said that. And then I'm going, how come I never saw that before? How come I never figured that out? So I'm thinking we need to bring those kinds of lessons into the schools to teach these young people. And yeah, my dad called it planting seeds. You're not in there to beat them over the head with a 2x4 and get them to comply, which is my dad's method, by the way, when I was a kid. But plant seeds.
I mean, I remember as a kid for 9/11, I was in the 8th grade and we go into civics class right after that. Cause I mean, we've watched the bombing or watched the plane hit the tower on TV. And I remember very vividly and distinctly, like my civics teacher is bawling.
Yeah.
And, and so like I understand what's happening and why it's a bad thing.
Yeah.
But I don't understand the magnitude of like the repercussions of what will happen because of this.
Exactly.
And so one of the kids in our class looked at him. He's like, it's just a plane hitting a building. Why are you crying? And so then he spends the next 4 weeks only teaching about why this is important.
Dad and I were fishing at Lake Monticello. We did all our really important discussions on a fishing boat in the lake.
Absolutely.
Early in the morning, nobody can, the whole lake can hear you. You know how sound carries before talking.
Oh, yeah.
I remember him saying something to the effect, this is May of 2001. This is months before 9/11. And I remember we got on the subject of Pearl Harbor, and he said, I wonder how these young people today would react if we had a Pearl Harbor. He said that in May. Or in March, actually, April. In May, he passed. And I remember standing at his grave right then and saying, Dad, man, I don't know. That's a good question. I guess we'll find out one day, maybe. I hope not. And then 9/11 happened. And I went to his grave that day. And I said, Dad, I guess we're going to get the answer to that question real quick.
Oh, yeah.
You know what? 2 weeks later, I'm standing at his grave. And I'm crying. I'm bawling like a baby. I said, Dad, you'd be so proud. I said, these young people, they're coming. They're going to do the right thing. We saw flags everywhere. We saw young men and women going right in, knowing fully what was coming up, what they were signing up for.
Oh, yeah. You knew. You were signing the line. You were going to basic training. And you were going across the ocean.
And it would have made my dad and his shipmates, all 1,195 of them, so proud, because that's why they signed up. History repeats itself.
I think it's a beautiful thing what you're doing, because you going out and sharing the story of your father and your mother is giving them eternal life that's different than, I think, it doesn't matter what, however you feel about, right, the afterlife. But it is one of those things where the sharing of these stories and generations, right? There's a children's cartoon called Coco. And Coco is all about the concept of the way that our family lives forever is in our memories and talking about them, and the importance of sharing their story generation to generation to generation. And you have all this weight that you bring of all this knowledge and being able to really straddle two totally different worlds. And being able to then share that perspective and then give that, and like you said, this thread, this really consistent, and it's one of the titles of a talk that you're going to be giving up here in the next little bit, Threads of Hope, and you're going to be able to give that hope and give that perspective. I'm really, really grateful for you to come and share your parents' story, share your story, and get this out there. I think the sharing of these stories of seemingly just normal people that lived in extraordinary times.
Yeah, I'll go anywhere where I'm asked to speak. Of course, I don't charge anything to military groups or schools. The only people I ever charged is a corporate entity or somebody like that, and that's because they're throwing money at me anyway. So, but I'll be up in New London, Connecticut for the 250th anniversary of the Navy, and I'm a speaker there at the New London Heritage Festival. Maritime Heritage Festival. And I'll be speaking every weekend, I think, in September. And then, like I said, I'll be in Portland, Oregon, with my buddy Chris Spence and a bunch of others speaking in schools in Portland, Oregon. Again, places that I think we need to be and share these stories.
You have a special event that's coming up that I want to raise awareness to. It's going to be probably about a week after this episode comes out. It's going to be right here in Waynesboro with Master Sergeant Spence.
Correct. Yeah, we're still in the planning stages. Set in concrete right now is Master Sergeant Christopher Spence. Chris. He's a close friend of mine. He was one of the 12-strong horse soldiers who first went into Afghanistan, Special Operations Army. They helicoptered in to the lowlands, were basically going to meet up with warlords and such and figure out who the good guys and bad guys were. And they were told while they were there that they would need to get on horseback and ride into the mountains. And only, I think he's told me one time, 3 of them had ever ridden a horse before. So imagine 12 Special Operations Army guys suddenly being thrown on top of horses, and they've got to learn as they go. So
in Afghanistan.
In Afghanistan, where people are shooting at you and everything. Yeah.
Perfect learning environment.
So a lot of incentive.
That's such a special operations thing too.
So Chris is going to be here to tell his story about those first days in Afghanistan. Following the pullout last year, yeah, year and a half ago, especially the reason why Chris feels like he needs to get out there and talk a little bit more to our young people, those who may make these decisions in the future. So I asked him if he would come and speak at Fishburne Military School on 9/11, and what a perfect day for him to be here is on September 11th. He will be at Fishburne all morning. As far as I know right now, they're formalizing all the plans, but he'll be free right after lunch. And right now I'm planning to invite him here to salute in the afternoon. Details will be announced, times and such, but he'll be here to share with us why it's important that we continue to support people like the Afghans, the people, not the crazies, not the Taliban, all of that, but protect the people, or at least not forget about them, because he was one-on-one in contact with them, and he went back, and he feels like that there's a need, that as humanitarians, as American military, that if we're ever going to do something good for people, that was an opportunity that we missed for the wrong reasons. He's trying to reach out and explain to these young people what the impact is of operations like we did in Afghanistan. All the work that was put in at the front end to win that war, and then the way it ended up, and how that's going to impact the Afghan people, and hence even the soldiers and sailors and Marines who put in the time and effort to fix a problem that didn't get fixed. So I think Chris's message is awesome, important. We'll announce details, but be looking at salute sometime in the afternoon on 9/11. And what I want to do is put at the front of the line our first responders, because they were the ones that were especially hit on 9/11, not only on site, but all across the country. They had to get ready for what was going on and what might happen. I want them to be at the front of the line to come here and hear Chris speak. So I'll be putting out invitations to our fire departments, police departments, medical personnel, and hopefully some of them will show up and hear Chris speak and be able to meet him and talk to him. He's one of the 12 original war soldiers, one of the 12 that went in. He's the one that took the picture of one of the soldiers, one of the special op guys on horseback, that ended up becoming the statue that represents the beginning of that conflict that was built in New York City. Rumsfeld held up that picture early in the beginning days of after 9/11 to explain, that we're there, we're doing something. And that picture clearly became famous as far as, being recognized as representative of what we were trying to do. Still is.
Thank you for listening to Veteran Story Hour, Voices of Valor, presented by Salute of Virginia. We're honored to share these real stories from real people, veterans, family members, and community leaders who served in all kinds of ways. If today's story resonated with you, we'd love for you to leave a review, follow the podcast, and share the episode with someone who needs to hear it. Every listen helps keep these voices alive and heard. New episodes drop twice a month, so stay tuned. We've got more stories coming your way. Stories of grit, grief, humor, healing, and the kind of truth that sticks with you. Until next time, take care of yourself, check in on someone you served with, and keep listening.